Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. On this episode, I'm helping to answer a human risk-related question that sounds simple, but in practice is really hard. It's something that's often asked of people who are responsible for managing human risk. The question is, how do we know how well we're doing? Or to put it another way, how can we measure the effectiveness of our activities? If you work in compliance, ethics, risk, or even as a regulator, you've probably at some point either been asked to demonstrate the effectiveness of your program or had questions asked about your budget or resources. And usually that's not because the person asking wants to give you more. And it's equally possible that you might yourself have wondered about how good a job you're actually doing. I know I did when I worked both as a regulator and as a compliance officer. Now, whatever the reason for the question, it's not an easy one to answer, because part of it involves proving a negative. You can easily show that you've helped make good things happen, but it's much harder to demonstrate that you've stopped bad things from happening. Which is why we often turn to input metrics like number of hours of training delivered, or the number of times a particular control was executed. That's interesting, but it doesn't really tell you how effective the outcome is, or isn't. Just because someone has been on a course and done a little exam doesn't mean the risk the training is designed to mitigate has been reduced. So how can we start to measure the effectiveness? That's what my two guests on this episode were interested in finding out. One of them, Professor Benjamin van Rooij, has been on the show 4 times. There are links to his previous appearances in the show notes. The other, Professor Melissa Rorie, is making her debut. Together, they've edited a book called Measuring Compliance, Assessing Corporate Crime and Misconduct Prevention, which contains chapters written by a number of eminent experts, 3 of whom, incidentally, Todd Hoare, Ricardo Palafone, and Florentine Blanc, have also been guests on the show. There are links to those episodes in the show notes as well. So if you work in a function whose role is to mitigate human risk, feel free to substitute the word compliance for whatever you're responsible for, because it's still relevant. And what Benjamin and Melissa have to say will be of interest. Because if you don't know how to measure the success of what you do, then there's even less chance that anyone else will. And that'll include people who set your budget, assess the quality of your program, or determine your compensation. In a discussion, we explore why measuring compliance matters, what the challenges of doing it are, and some of the ways in which we can go about it. Benjamin and Melissa are not only leading experts in their fields, but they're great company. So please enjoy this episode on measuring compliance. Benjamin, welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. And Melissa, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you so much.
I am really excited. And look, Benjamin, since you're an old hand at this, I don't think I need to introduce you to the audience because they will have listened to the previous episodes. If they haven't, they'll be going to the show notes to check those out. So Melissa, can you just tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
Sure, absolutely. So my name is Melissa Rorie. I am an associate professor at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. So I'm a lot of fun just by virtue of being in Las Vegas. I predominantly do research in the criminology and criminal justice domain. I do explore research in regulatory domains as well. But generally speaking, I focus on corporate crime and especially theoretical perspectives about why corporate crime occurs. I have been at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas for 9 years now, and just recently stepped into the department chair role of the Department of Criminal Justice. So always changing, always a lot of fun. And again, just happy to be here and on this podcast. So thank you again, Christian.
Look, it's an absolute thrill to have both of you here because I love what you do individually, but you've come together to publish a book that is called Measuring Compliance. And the most obvious question to start with is like, what does that mean and why would we want to do that?
Well, I mean, this all started for us with a lunch at a conference.
Yep.
And it's one of those lunches that in the end entails a whole lot of work. But a whole lot of fun and very important. So for me,
there's no such thing as a free lunch, right? We've learned that.
Yeah, if I had known then what I know now.
Yeah, exactly. So we both came to this to sort of see that in the study and also the practice of compliance, sort of the elephant in the room is how do we actually know what we know? So in the academic world, and we're both in the academic world, we have a lot of approaches to study compliance where sort of nobody really speaks about how hard it is actually to measure it.
Mm-hmm.
And we've sort of accepted the way we study it, even though there is not a single way to do it 100% well. Then we also saw that in practice, there was increasingly the question of how do you know whether your intervention is effective? And regulators and law enforcement was increasingly putting pressure on companies to make sure to show what actually works. So we saw that also in practice, the measurement question really came up. And that's where I think we both came together in this.
Yeah, and I'll just add to your talking about how people really operate in different silos, right? We have people who work on regulation from like a legal perspective, from a political science perspective, from a public policy perspective, and then from a criminological perspective as well, or a sociological perspective as well. And so within these different domains, people have different conceptualizations about what the compliance behavior even really means. People prioritize certain research methods over others. There's this whole, kind of a camp, if you will, of quantitative researchers versus qualitative researchers in a sense. And there hasn't really, until this book, really been a comprehensive kind of overview of the different strengths and limitations of the methods as they relate to compliance research, and especially corporate compliance research. So we were luckily Benjamin had this great idea to kind of come together and address all of these different issues, all of these different challenges in really kind of sussing out how do we measure corporate crime and how do our corporate compliance, and how do we, measure the effectiveness of corporate compliance programs in practice. And this is not just a scholarly issue or a theoretical issue. It is very much a practical issue. So again, we were really trying to bridge a lot of different gaps in this book.
We also really felt that the book had to be interesting for our colleagues in academia as well as for people in practice. And that's what we set out to do. I think the other reason for the two of us to do this is that if you look at these two camps, even though we're both multi-camp, but Melissa is much more quantitative than I am, and I'm more qualitative. So we sort of bring that together.
And look, I'm absolutely delighted you published it. As I said to you before we started recording, it's the book I wish I'd had. Because when we look at how much money and not just like hard cash, but also just time is spent on this compliance effort, it's an incredible amount of money. And when we look at the sort of, how do we know we're getting value for money? And in a cost-constrained environment, that's particularly important. The answer is we don't. And so we rely on, and I say this as someone that has relied on this, you sort of go, well, we have to be here. So you rely on sort of incumbents' rights. You rely on, well, the regulator won't like it. And that, of course, is not a very compelling argument when you look at other things that you might spend money on, say, marketing. If a marketing person, well, you have to have us, obviously, that would be quite destructive. So what you're really doing is answering from the business side is a really key question. It's like, what are we getting for our money, and why are we spending this much on those resources?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll just throw in here, I was very lucky to go to graduate school at the University of Maryland, which is in the criminological domain and in more of the traditional criminological domain, they were the ones about a decade or even 15 years ago that put out this whole What Works report that emphasized the need for rigorous methods to truly assess what correctional programs, what juvenile delinquency programs worked and what was cost effective. And I think that the issue I had with that is that they really emphasized experimental methods, right? They said experimental methods, randomized controlled trials. That is how we know what works, what is effective. And so the thing I love about working with Benjamin is that, yes, he is a little bit more qualitative. I'm a little bit more quantitative, but we both recognize that no method is inherently better than another method. We focus in this book very strongly on the idea that all methods are worthwhile, all methods have their strengths and are worthy of pursuing, but it really depends on your research question. So we focus more on making sure that your research question drives your methods and that different methods really apply well to different research questions, instead of what we see so often in practice is that your methods or the data that you have or the people that you have around you kind of drive your research question Or even worse, you're using methods that aren't really appropriate or aren't really going to answer your research question.
Can you talk a little bit about the people you've gathered together? Because as I looked at the sort of contributor list, I mean, you've pulled in some of the rock stars in the field, and I was delighted to see that it's both academics and practitioners. Talk a little bit about how you selected those people, and maybe name drops a few of them as well.
So for us, what was really important is to have a couple of cutting edge people from practice. And of course, there's many others that I've also met and learned and got to know later. And I see that the last 2 or 3 years, there's a lot of people actually doing quite sophisticated work or really sophisticated work in practice. So for instance, Hui Chun, she has been agenda setting, obviously, not only because of her work at the Department of Justice earlier on compliance, but also sort of writing sort of critically about the sort of knowledge gap in compliance, also together with Eugene Soltz, who is at Harvard Business School, who's also in the book. So Hui Chun, we had to have, and her chapter provides a really good sort of historical background why measurement has come up, but also the dangers of measurement. I think that's an important thing. I mean, we are all into measurement now, but that's also going to sort of force people into focusing on the lower hanging fruit, on the things we can prove, which means that the more complex compliance problems are not the ones you can easily measure, may actually have less sort of priority. I think Hui Chun, the other person there is Riccardo Pellafone. Riccardo is very interesting because he comes from, having worked in multiple functions in-house and also as a lawyer, to starting his own company, which he just sold. And he's really, he just told me that. I mean, we had a session with Riccardo 3 weeks ago. And he's really somebody who looks at, okay, how can companies use their own data that they already have? So very practical. So I think those are the two key practitioners that we have in the book. Then we have Florentin Blanc and Paolo Coletti from the OECD. And Florentin also earlier was at the World Bank, also practitioners, but people who are very academic and who had a very different view. We found what they were doing was, on the one hand, really on sort of the outcomes. So the amount of death, for instance, that you have because of food safety. I mean, a very different approach, and also aggregate level data. So not just looking at the firm, but more at a larger jurisdiction. So those are the people we selected for these reasons. I think the others are all academics that we both knew, A, were at the top of their field, B, that provided the kind of variety that we were looking for. And there's too many to mention all of them. We'll mention them in the interview as comes. And then there's this weird thing that we have this one author, I think she's called Melissa Rorie, who's on several chapters. And this was really because of on the one hand, her knowledge on all these things and having worked on them. On the other hand, also she's been kind enough to work on chapters that we both felt, well, I wish we had somebody there, but we didn't. And in one, we worked together. So we tried to, if we couldn't find people or people weren't available, either Melissa did it or Melissa and I did it. Yep. And we did our best.
We did do our best. That is absolutely right.
The lovely thing for me is that a number of the people that feature our previous guests on this show, so links to those in the show notes, Ricardo being one, Todd Hall being another one, and we will obviously make sure that I mop up the remaining people that haven't appeared on the show in later ones. But what I thought was fascinating was this is not about, and I think this probably comes from the fact that you're blending a sort of practitioner audience and an academic audience, is that you're not sitting there kind of proposing a checklist of answers. It's a lovely way of just going, this is really hard. And I could see a temptation to go, it would be perfectly feasible to write a book and saying, here is the silver bullet, the magic solution. And instead what you do is point out that actually what compliance means in one organization might be very different, and the challenges you're facing will be very different. And so this is a book that forces you to, it's almost one that doesn't provide, it provides suggestions but not answers. And you're trying to force people to think.
One of the reasons why I felt comfortable enough writing chapters that maybe I'm not necessarily known for, like randomized experiments and stuff like that. I teach a methods class. I've taught methods since, probably at least 12 years at this point. And one of the things I always emphasize in that class is, again, there's no right answer. I mean, exam questions, stuff like that, sure. But like generally speaking, when you're approaching research, when you're trying to gain knowledge about something, there's no one way to do it. Again, there's no randomized experiments are great, but they're not great for every single research question that you have. Different research methods have different strengths and limitations that you really need to be thoughtful about how you approach research. And so in our book, we really tried to abstain from, advocating for one single research method over another. Obviously, we talk a lot about mixed methods as kind of a solution to a lot of our problems, but we recognize not only that research questions differ in terms of the sorts of information that you need to answer them, and in terms of the different people that you might need to talk to, if you need to talk to people at all. But in addition, you also have to recognize that we operate under very practical constraints. And just because you may not have the money or the resources to do a very resource-intensive ethnography or a very resource-intensive randomized control trial, that doesn't mean that you should give up. And that doesn't mean that you shouldn't pursue research that can make those contributions that we need so much these days.
I think the way for both practitioners and academics to use the book is, the kind of overview that we're now talking about is in the introduction. Sort of the background to why we have measurement is in part 1, where you can see sort of the chapter by Rooij and also Karen van Wingerde and also Lieselot Bisschop's chapter. But I think really the part 2 and part 3 are sort of different methods, each chapter one method. And just go into the chapter, you read the chapter. For instance, you as a company or as a researcher are already doing surveys. Great. Read the chapter. You're going to be better at it. You're going to see where maybe some of the problems are, and you're going to be able to improve it. Maybe you're considering a certain method. Read the chapter, see whether it actually fits. And maybe if it doesn't fit, read some of the other chapters and see which one fits better. What's very useful there is to also read the introduction, because the introduction provides an overview, one scheme that we put a lot of time on, where you sort of see the trade-offs of different methods, and you can sort of see, okay, what is it you really care about? For instance, do you want to understand the complexity of an issue? You want to understand really what happened in a particular problem. Then you try and do ethnography or interviews and focus groups. If you want to really have a less costly option, that's really feasible, because of course ethnography is very costly, you move more towards using existing data or risk analysis proxies, for instance. If you want to establish causal relationship, if that's what you're all about, you do randomized experiments. And we've sort of, in that scheme, which is on page 15, sort of tried to show, okay, this is where you can position yourself. And then you go to the chapters, and then you find out, okay, what are the things I should be doing or not be doing? And some of the things in there, for instance, the chapter that Melissa and I did on interviews, it has a lot of pointers that are very practical, based on years of experience, both of the people that we review, as well as, for instance, in this chapter, on my own nearly 15 years of work on interviewing people about illegal behavior.
As you talk about it, in a way, if you wanted a kind of, right, this is absolutely what you should do, just follow these steps, kind of instruction manual, you're going to be bitterly disappointed, right? Because it's clearly that is not what it's, unashamedly not what it's about. And one of the things I thought was really interesting as I read it is you've kind of exposed one of the sort of prevalent trends, which is you have consultants that come in and tell you, follow our framework, do this, and you'll be fine. and closely associated with that is the kind of best practice philosophy, which of course presupposes that what's good for one person, if indeed it is good for them, right, is automatically good for someone else. And also this regulatory trend of sort of comparing what firms are doing. So the trick is we don't want to be an outlier of the pack. So we'll just stay in the middle of the pack. And you've kind of exposed all those things and said, actually, that might be a valid strategy, but you understand why you're doing and what you're doing. And that's quite challenging for people who have either just done what we've always done, or done what the people over there are doing, or done it slightly better than those people there, haven't really thought about why. And so you're really posing, to practitioners at least, quite a big challenge.
I think you're right. I do think that several of the chapters do really provide do's and don'ts. So again, going back to the interview chapter, it really shows, for instance, the value of doing a pilot study and of understanding sort of what the language is that you can and can't use, and then building from that pilot study into a structure that allows you to build an interview strategy. And it shows you different sort of strategies. For instance, if you want to understand what happened and you work with informants, compared to you want to compare what people are thinking over a group and you work with respondents. So that's pretty hands-on. And I think some of the chapters are like that. Are hands-on. I think also, for instance, the chapter by Eugene Soltz shows some, I would say, I'm not sure we use the word best practices, but it shows some practices major corporations have used to leverage out of data. I think Ricardo's chapter as well. So I think on the one hand, it is nuanced and it is showing all the things that are difficult and not working, but it's not leaving readers, I think, completely helpless. It does, I think, build a lot of the, it warns them of certain things that really are not working, which I think is a big help. Second, it does offer some of the things that, steps they should undertake to make it better.
So yeah, I just want to add, I think you're right, Christian, in that we do encourage people to think very critically about people coming in and telling them they should do things a certain way. But at the same time, as you mentioned, all of those things are very valid for certain purposes, right? I love what consultants do. And I think that, consultation is very important for promoting corporate compliance and making sure that corporations are doing what they need to do. I also think, obviously, comparing firms to one another is an incredible way to understand kind of the state of the industry and to identify what Gunningham et al. Would call laggards versus, beyond compliance behaviors, those sorts of things. And that can really serve as a good metric. But what we want to do, I think, more than anything, is encourage people to think beyond what they've always done. To encourage them to think not necessarily even critically, but think creatively about the way that they approach these research questions and these compliance questions, and to provide them with something that can, serve as a really good guide. And I will say one of the things that we did or tried to do is make sure that the language is very accessible. I know I go on my soapbox a lot about how academics always write for other academics and they don't necessarily write for a popular audience. So we really did encourage our authors to write for a more popular audience in order to make sure that we were reaching these compliance practitioners while also making it interesting enough for other academics to think about as well. So again, definitely thinking critically is an important part of it, but also providing what Benjamin was talking about, clear ideas for how to move forward with this and not just feel like you're not doing enough, I think is really important.
For the avoidance of doubt, I think you succeeded on the speaking to practitioners. At least I understood it, which tells me that it's at the appropriate level, having been one. But I think what was fascinating about it is having said that you posed the complexity, and as you rightly point out, it's not just kind of like, this is really difficult, go off and sort yourself out. Here's some ideas for how you might think about that. But one of the things that's interesting in a compliance context is that, and sometimes it's a convenient excuse, and sometimes it's genuine, is that, well, regulators won't allow that. And so it's very clear that there are different forms of regulatory regime. And if we look at certain, particularly in the US, it is often very, I'll tell you what to do. And the consequence for not following the letter of the law is very strict. On the other hand, you've got other principle-based regulators that are much more interested in, are you trying to do the right thing? And does this look at the rest? But that excuse of regulators won't allow this is one of the most common reasons cited for not doing things. And I wonder what your collective thoughts were on that. I think you answer it, but nonetheless, even if you read it, you could say, I would love to do this, but they, whoever they happen to be, won't allow me.
So I think there's two sides to this. So one is, of course, our book also speaks to regulators and people doing regulatory studies. So I think regulators, as well as law enforcement and prosecutors, first of all, they have to become interested in effectiveness and in outcomes and impact. So they have to move beyond sort of the old process, the old process based and the sort of output based rather than outcome. I think the second thing is they have to understand, if you're going to understand outcome and impact, you need to understand causality and you need to understand the measurements there. And So that's, I think, why our book is also very much marketed towards that audience. And I do know that regulators increasingly also have behavioral units with people who are trained in this. I think the other part in this is much more, and maybe not only a problem of regulators, it's a problem largely of risk. The other day we had a session where we also discussed this, and the problem is sometimes you don't want to know. So there may be a dark number, and maybe with a better method, what plausible deniability do you have? So there are several issues here. So you work in compliance management at a firm, and you set up this great measurement of, let's say, a dark number. So first of all, are the people in the C-suite going to be happy because it costs a lot of money? No. Because, can you show that it's value? That's the first hard thing. So unless the regulator demands it, it's hard to show that there's value there. Second thing is the law department is not going to like it because it may increase liability because you know of illegal behavior. And whatever you're doing in compliance measurement, at some point you're going to measure illegal behavior. So that's sort of the problem. There is also an internal problem there. And I think our book doesn't fully get into these sort of strategies. We do, of course, know that our readers are very well aware of this because they're in the middle of this in their jobs. I do hope that our book shows readers who are in these situations, a better sort of set of insights that they can communicate with regulators. B, also that they can develop better strategies that they can sell to C-suite and to law departments to show, look, we're going to get better information, but we can still do so in a way that manages liability. I think there's so much in here of different options of methods that will fit these different purposes.
Yeah, and I would agree with that completely. And I think, when we write the next book, Benjamin, or the next version of the book, Benjamin, this is something we should pay a little bit more attention to. But one thing to note is that, academics too, not just practitioners, work within very practical constraints. Like institutional review boards or ethics boards will often tell us that we can't do certain things in our research. So one of the things that I think is implicit in our book is, again, within the constraints that you're operating under, whether it be regulatory concerns or resource concerns or economic concerns or access concerns, there are options, and there are options to do things well, So I think that's really ultimately kind of the goal of the book, is to provide people with options that even if they're not able to do the perfect study or the perfect research, they can do something, and they can do something in such a way that makes a really strong contribution to the world.
What can be interesting here, we did a session also with practitioners and academics on compliance shocks. So what happens if the police lift somebody in your company off their bed at 4 a.m. in the morning? And what is sort of the aftermath for compliance management? What we learned in the session is compliance shocks are vital for people in compliance to sort of introduce new methods and new measurements. And we've had one compliance manager from a big multinational complaining, we haven't had big compliance shocks. But for all those who have, and I think the majority has in their industry, leverage out of this and then be ready with your strategy. Even if you can't do things now, you may be able to do a better, more sophisticated way of interventions plus measurement once the sort of extra pressures come in. And also when the extra pressure from regulators comes in, tell them, look, next time we are going to do this, we're going to measure it. In order to measure it, we need to do that well. And here are a number of strategies that we can combine. I think our book is very useful to make those arguments.
Mm-hmm. And I love that depiction of shocks, because I think you're right. It presents itself as a big threat, because why the hell didn't you clock this? On the other hand, it's a massive opportunity. That's when budgets get maximized, because you have to sort it out, because seeing what it looks like. And so I think that's a tremendous opportunity. But I think one of the things that's fascinating for me is when you read it, it's a little bit like you're putting on a pair of glasses that goes, I should be able to justify why I'm doing this. And I mean that both from an economic sense, but also, what the hell am I doing spending my time in compliance?
Yep.
If I don't know whether am I actually having the results? Because, what are you here to do on this planet? Well, we all like to have a sense of purpose.
Yep.
And so I like this idea that one, it was a way, even if you couldn't implement some of the stuff because of political, financial, regulatory constraints, is you can say to yourself, well, actually, what would I do if I was unconstrained? And therefore, how can I push this within the opportunities I have to the max? A vision for what life could be like, recognizing that you can't immediately get there.
Yeah.
Because that's actually how you'll develop incremental benefits. And so I thought actually not just from a practical perspective, but particularly as we look at, people looking for a sense of purpose in their roles, is you start to unpick that thing of going, okay, I no longer want, as I look for, why am I commuting? Why am I working for this employer? Why have I, COVID's posed all these questions. We can actually say to ourselves, well, actually, what could I be doing? And is this good enough for me? Am I happy with the compromise that's being made? And very often I think people think that they can only do what they can do in the current environment. At least show them what that world would look like. This is what compliance could be. And if I can't deliver that here, what am I doing? Could I stretch it a bit further? Or maybe I go somewhere else.
So what I think is interesting about your analysis here is, look, compliance has sort of grown really rapidly from something more ad hoc to something that's professionalizing. And if your identity in that profession really becomes stronger, at some point you need methods. And I think if you use our book, you read our book, that it's not just the theories that are in the handbook or in other volumes. I think the professional identity at some point is, look, I know what I'm doing because I understand that I can measure it. I understand that maybe I can't measure it fully right now because of constraints. And I understand that measurement is difficult, but at least I know what measurement would look like. And I can discuss that. And I can discuss the limits of measurement. I can discuss what we know and what we don't know. And that, I think, is the next generation of a professionalized compliance professional. I think that professional can talk much better with regulators, with leadership, with lawyers and others. And I think that's really what our book helps so much about. The other part is in terms of, okay, what is my job about? Okay, if it's about effectiveness, at least our book shows all the different options you have to get a better understanding of that. Of course, for most, you can't do a randomized controlled trial or ethnography, but anybody can do an interview. Most people can do a focus group. Most people can run some sort of a survey. Mm-hmm. But if you're going to do any of that, you can now do it much better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Christian, I'll just add, I hope that our book is having that sort of impact on people in terms of encouraging people to know that they can make a difference, that they are making a difference, right? I mean, I know Benjamin and I are in this field because we feel very strongly about our work having an impact on compliance in practice, right? That's why we do what we do. And so I think the other part of this too is that we are showing these people that are writing chapters are people who have actually done this stuff. So it is possible to do this stuff, to implement these methods in order to get a really good understanding of what is actually happening in their environment, right? And one of the things we talk about in the first chapter in particular is the utility of practitioner-scholar collaborations. Not only, and it's definitely not a one-way street, practitioners, I think there's sometimes an assumption by scholars to think that they are, the experts in something, or that they have so much to give to people in practice. And that's just not true. Practitioners have just as much to give scholars, if not more. They are the ones that see these things on a day-to-day basis, that understand how things work on the ground. And if anything, scholars benefit more from having that real world knowledge and from getting input from them. But I think overall, there are, again, bridges to be built between the two domains that can help practitioners reach these ideal kind of methods for understanding kind of the dark figure of compliance, whether or not compliance is actually happening. And then on the other side, of course, giving scholars access to data, to people, these sorts of things that can further help research and theory in order to develop a broader understanding of what's happening in the industry as a whole. Right. So that's one thing I want to emphasize is that, I hope we're having that impact on people. I hope we are encouraging people to think ideally about what could happen, because it can happen. And then to think about methods by which those sorts of ideal visions can be brought to fruition. A lot of that will have to be more practitioner-scholar relationships.
And for the avoidance of doubt, I think you absolutely do live that value. And one of the things I think is interesting is that a lot of the things that I read, I found myself nodding and thinking, actually, I've never quite pushed it that far, either when I was a practitioner or with my clients, but actually it's just quite helpful to know that somebody else has thought about this independent of the day-to-day noise. And therefore there's a bit of ballast there. And if you're having that conversation with your boss who's going, why are we doing this? Why do you need, you've at least got something you can point to that's not just here's an idea I had in the shower, which of course might be a very valid idea, but you're providing that balance. And I think that exchange of information, I think, is incredibly healthy. So from my perspective, you absolutely do that. I mean, you wouldn't have written a book, right? Because academics that write books, particularly ones that have practitioner titles that are interesting, you wouldn't be doing that if you weren't interested in targeting that audience. So I want to absolutely encourage my listeners to think about it in those terms, the feedback loop. And I think it's incredibly healthy to have that interaction. And one of the things I think is fascinating is that I've seen a lot of resistance from people going, well, I don't want to share data with academics. Well, the only way we get these kinds of books is if we're taking what your research is doing and having some real world data. So we need to kind of feed both ecosystems.
I think there's another sort of hybrid option that's increasingly developing. It's the academics going in-house, so in the behavioral teams. And I think what our book also helps people with that are building these teams is to sort of better understand what sort of disciplines do you need. And one of the things I've seen is, so for instance, one of my former students is head of behavior at one of the major social media companies in the US. She's building all these behavioral teams because of, well, there's one team on suicide and there's one team on terrorism and so many behavioral problems. Mm-hmm. And she really asked me, what sort of expertise do I need? There's so much out there. And I think the way to answer it is not to start with the theories, it's to start with the methods. Because people are most strongly, I think, developed methodologically. So, I mean, some of the better teams I've seen have the same combination as Melissa and I have in terms of having qualitative and quantitative. That allows you a deep understanding, but also a very good measurement of causality and also generalizability. I think if you have that combination and you get it to work, that's golden. That's just the best combination. I think our book helps people to think about that better.
And you talked a lot about, particularly the chapters where you couldn't find someone to write them. So there was a bit of exploring. I'm intrigued by what you discovered there, either in the bits that you did already know about other people wrote or the bits that you were yourselves exploring. Are there any sort of things that surprised you in what you found?
I mean, as somebody who really doesn't do a lot of interviews, I thought the chapter on the interview strategies for assessing undetected legal deviance really, it's a chapter about how to interview powerful people and to get them to talk about kind of dirty secrets, if you will. I don't know. That might be sexing it up a little bit too much, but in essence, that's really kind of what we were going for, and just some of the ways, it seems like it should be really common sense if you're, somebody who talks to other people on a day-to-day basis, but there are some really interesting kind of considerations to take into an interview setting with you. And I cite a lot this excellent book by Rita Faria and her co-authors that directly talks about talking to powerful people, researching up, if you will. That is so difficult for people in both regulatory and corporate compliance domains to really address. So I think out of all of the chapters that I worked on, that chapter in particular was the most engaging and the most interesting. And I mean, honestly, it's interesting if you think about just being a human being and how to talk to people in general. Thinking about interview strategies is helpful, whether or not you're doing research, if you're just trying to figure out if your teenage stepkid has done anything bad, right? So that was one of the most interesting chapter for a lot of reasons from my perspective.
It was such a pleasure to work with Melissa on this for me. So for me, this is sort of the bread and butter of my core knowledge. If there's one thing I've learned to do, it's to get people, and I did that mostly in China, to talk about things they would never talk about. So I drew a lot of my experience, for instance, about interviewing 100 lawyers in China about their own tax evasion. How do you get lawyers to admit tax evasion? I mean, that's what I spent half a year developing that. And that sort of came together with Melissa looking at the literature on how to interview elites, and with me sort of drawing on the just practice of trying to do this over the years. I think for me, the big lesson there, I thought the data simulations It was a really a cutting edge chapter that Matt West and Melissa did to really show, okay, if we use sort of the elements of data science, and there's probably a whole new book we could do just on data science and compliance, and we apply that to deal with some of the statistical issues that we have in traditional compliance measurement and analysis. There was a lot there that you can really see, okay, we can use quite complex mathematics, but in ways that really deal with problems that we have. So I thought that was really a fascinating chapter. I think the meta-analysis chapter and systematic review chapter by Natalie Schell-Bussy, who's also a former co-author of Melissa Rorie, and together they've done fabulous meta-analysis.
We're updating the corporate crime meta-analysis right now, so
I look forward to that. I mean, that's a big paper, that's massive, and that's discussed also in the chapter. So I think anybody who's in compliance has to understand how you draw out conclusions from a large amount of studies. And the big problem that I see in practice is that, and by the way, in academia as well, is sometimes we have this one study and everybody's talking about it. So for instance, signing at the top or signing at the bottom study, or the daycare study. I mean, a singular study is like a swallow. It doesn't announce spring, as we say in Dutch. You need a body of work. And the whole tradition that Melissa was trained in at Maryland, which you mentioned, is let's take a review of a body of work and see what we know what works. And that I haven't seen yet sufficiently in regulatory studies and compliance. I think it's only just now starting. There's too much of, I've done study X and I'm going to practice, and study X will solve all your problems because we found X. That's not how it works. You need a large amount of studies. You have to understand what you can draw out from it, what it does and doesn't show. And that, I think, really that chapter shows very well also the limits of doing that.
I think it's really interesting that obviously Benjamin is more of a qualitative person and talked about two very quantitative chapters. I'm much more of a quantitative person. We talked about a qualitative chapter. So again, this is kind of a lesson I think that we really encourage people to think about is regardless of your kind of, for academics in particular, regardless of your kind of methodological domain, there's something in this book that will encourage you to think creatively about your own assumptions, about your own methodological preferences, and you can find it very engaging. And I should just mention here too that chapter on data simulations, Matthew West should be the person you talked about data simulations. I understand it to a certain extent, but I really just tried to help translate what he was doing. He is doing some amazing stuff. He's doing some amazing stuff, and it's well above and beyond my statistical knowledge. So talk to Matthew West if you have questions about data simulations. I'll leave that there.
And I love that. That was a good, great articulation. I mean, several things come out for me. One is, Benjamin, I love your comment around the sign at the top thing, which has become this kind of gospel, going, great, we'll just do that, and then we can move on. And sort of, or the picture of the plane being shot at, and everybody quotes Abraham Wold, and then well, that's all. I've now understood that. That's fine. I can move on to the next thing.
Yep.
Partly because it's visual, I think. So that I love this idea of kind of going, one thing, fine. Let's have a look at, because guess what? It may turn out not to replicate in your environment or be at all relevant.
Well, and that's I mean, going through so many studies over the last years for this book and the other books I did, I've sort of developed an algorithm in my head. The cooler the title of the study, the higher ranked the journal it's published in, and the more media attention, the less likely it will replicate. Mm-hmm. And those are exactly the studies people in practice will get to learn.
Right.
I mean, the one advice I would give to anybody reading our book is pick a chapter you have never heard of and that you've never used as a method, and read that, because that will make you creative. That's sort of what happened with Melissa and me. So for Melissa, you've probably never done ethnography or even interviews other than how we all do job interviews. And for me, for instance, with data simulations, it is where you start thinking anew about what you have been doing if you're reading about things that are completely different from it. And I think that's a good thing about the book, because it's so broad. There's so many things you can just go into that you've never done, and maybe you find out, wow, that is something you can do.
What also fascinated me was the skill set that this points towards compliance officers needing. Now, I recognize that in extremis, you if your organization is large enough, right, you're going to want to hire people with the specific specialisms to be able to handle these issues. But if we look at sort of smaller organizations, if you said to people, what is the traditional skill set you need for compliance? You'd probably get things like knowledge of the rules, which I would argue potentially is quite low down on the list, because actually this is around persuading people, understanding, communicating, interrogating, thinking creative. There's a load of other things that and so as I was reading, I thought this is interesting because actually this points to the sorts of skills that people in compliance can and should develop. It points to the sorts of people we should be trying to attract into the discipline. And actually, it seemed to me that in many respects, the thing that we think we're trying to do, the skill, the role of it, the traditional role, if you ask the average person to describe it, is not necessarily what in the 21st century we need in terms of a skill set. And I'm not a massive fan of the word compliance because I think it sends all the wrong signals, but just look at the sort of the job specs. I think that's fundamentally shifting. And you raise a really interesting point here around the sorts of skills that I think people ought to be hiring and developing.
Yeah. No, I fully agree. So first of all, at some point, there's going to be a next generation of lawyers and compliance people who both understand law at a lawyer's level and social and behavioral science. I mean, it's bound to happen. It's already happening. There's sort of mixed degree programs. So I think that's one. Until that's the case, we need two kinds of people. We need to have people that are sort of more in law, but that at least understand causality. At its basic, understand that compliance entails a sort of situation where A at some point shapes B and interacts with all kinds of other things. If you have that basic understanding, and understanding of B, which is the outcome, is hard to measure, and the causality, sort of isolating the sort of intervention to the effect, is hard to do, then already you're a very long way ahead of then having proper conversations with different people about this. So then you can ask people, okay, what you're offering me in terms of compliance, how do you actually know the basic situation before the intervention? How do you know then what the intervention will do? You can ask the right questions once you go through that. Second, at some point, these people also understand better, okay, if we're building a team, this is sort of the combination of people we need, given the sort of methods that we're going to use. They don't need to be specialists in these methods, but they at least need to understand sort of the causality and the building blocks of the different interventions.
Yeah, and I would definitely agree with that too. And I think part of the thing that's so important is that we need to recognize that law is always changing too. So what was compliant behavior before may no longer be compliant behavior. So practitioners and regulators, obviously it's so important for them to have that foundational knowledge of law. But I think what we do here, and in particular in the chapters that I wrote, I really tried to encourage thinking about this as like a problem to be solved, right? So randomized experiments, again, it's hard to do, but I use examples in the chapter of if you have a training on sexual harassment that you need to determine if that training is actually having the impact it's having, this causal impact that Benjamin was just talking about, you can do that within your corporation and you can actually do it pretty easily. So it's really encouraging to think about needing to understand causality and also needing to understand actual behavior and what actual non-compliance or what actual compliance might look like and how to examine that and observe that directly, right? So the chapters on ethnography, Benjamin's great chapter on ethnography, the interview chapters really focus on direct observation and understanding what you're looking at and when you're looking at compliance versus non-compliance. And then also, I think one of the chapters that's really important is the one by Michelle Potts and Sarah Renfret that examines compliance and regulation as a process, right? It's not simply a yes-no sort of dichotomous outcome. You're either compliant or you're not. There's an entire process that occurs in which compliance, is not just simply a behavior. It's also an understanding of what is expected of you. So I think you're absolutely right, Christian, is that the skill set that we're looking at and encouraging is very different and is also very adaptable in this incredibly dynamic environment.
Yeah.
And it sort of struck me that in the same way that the role of compliance is not to make the average employee a micro compliance officer.
Right.
It is to give them enough knowledge to be able to do their job in a compliant manner. And maybe you can do that by stealth, right? They don't even realize that they know they're being compliant. They're just doing it because that feels natural.
Yeah.
It struck me that many of the things you're talking about are a case of compliance people don't need to necessarily be experts in all these disciplines, right? You need to know enough for what it means for what you're trying to do. And therefore, of course, the simple thing of what are you trying to do, which is the genesis of what you're talking about.
Well, and I think a really vital thing here is once you follow sort of this through from a measurement perspective, as the book does, you do get a really deep insight in how to manage compliance. I think part of the problem I've sometimes seen is that this sort of top-down view that if we get the incentives right in compliance, then everything will be okay. But if you understand that in order to change behavior, you have to get trustworthy information about the behavior. And in order to get that, you sort of need to get the trust of the people that you're working with. And sometimes you see that certain, for instance, negative incentives, they lead to a distrust in an organization where lower employees are not going to talk with higher level or with middle management even. At some point, you get this big gap where you don't know what's happening lower. That's going to undermine your complete compliance system. It's going to develop a negative culture. That's something, if you understand methods and you understand, for instance, interviews, or you understand the trustworthiness of surveys, you will see coming along long ahead of this. Mm-hmm. I've been in sessions with people, with legal scholars and legal practitioners. They don't see this at all, and they're designing these systems that anybody who understands methods would say, well, this is probably going to push the behavior deeper into the organization, and it will become invisible, and nobody trusts anything anymore, and it'll look good at the top for a while until you get a massive scandal. So I think thinking about methods also makes you a better compliance manager, even if you're not using it just to measure.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a really significant thing, because these systems that are created, they're logical. So overuse of zero tolerance, right? So let's just let a very clear signal we don't. And then you just kind of think about it and go, well, okay, if you've said that, if somebody's inadvertently crossed the line, then they're not going to come forward, right? So congratulations, you've just hidden all of that behavior. Yeah. And I think it's these psychological responses to what seem like, and this is what I love, because I mean, you really, it's inherent in the work that you both do, but you're really unpicking this thing of saying, okay, we can approach things logically, or we can approach things behaviorally. Mm-hmm. Yes. And we know this, classic behavioral science, right? People don't always behave logically, in inverted commas, rationally. No. And so we have to start designing these systems that require us to kind of peer behind that and think about what's actually going to happen and how do real people behave in the real world.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in the next version of the book, I would say, Melissa, sort of the implications of if you design your measurement well. So for instance, if you design a really good survey, and I think most compliance managers at some point use surveys, and survey design is an art. I mean, it's definitely, especially for illegal behavior, getting around, I mean, social desirability bias, getting to understand causality, being able to understand which variables you do take on and you don't. If you do that really well, you probably understand your organization much better. Mm-hmm. You probably understand much better how compliance works and how you can manage it. So you can also switch it around. Methods are a way towards better management, even if it's not just about measurement.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And, you know, Benjamin, you talked a little bit earlier about maybe encouraging people to think about the methods even before thinking about theory, because when you do approach things with a single theoretical kind of paradigm, like deterrence, for example, which we know doesn't necessarily drive behavior the way that we would expect to, you do set up your methods. When you approach it with a single theoretical paradigm, it does set up your methods in a certain way to either prove or disprove that theory. If you start instead by thinking about, okay, what can I do to just simply gather information without these sorts of assumptions behind it, it sets you up to just simply see what you see. And I think
that's important. I mean, you're making a vital point. So one of the big problems in academia and in practice is we're often measuring the effect of a single variable or two or three on an outcome. Mm-hmm. So we just did a new analysis of all the COVID data. So I have 2 years worth of social distancing data from the Netherlands now. But we work together now with a complexity scientist, where we did a so-called network analysis, which is not a social network analysis, but it sort of mathematically groups a whole number of variables together. And what we found, and the paper is now under revisions with a good journal, what we found is compliance in the end, you can't see it through a singular variable or even a small set. They're all interacting. they're all shaping each other and shaping compliance and being shaped by compliance. And once we saw the whole network, we got a completely different understanding. So I think that's also a really big lesson, is that don't just focus on a single intervention, try and combine multiple variables, which requires you to develop better measures and better measurement.
Love that. So you've talked a little bit about what you're going to do in the next editions of the book. Is there anything that was on the cutting room floor that didn't quite make it that's worth picking up, a sort of little tidbit or secret that didn't quite make it into the book?
A lot. There's so much more that we could do. I think the one that stands out to me, I think at this point, Benjamin, the cultural analysis part, is that right? That was something that was that we had thought about including and didn't quite make it.
I'm still working on it.
Oh, good. Well,
I mean, this project that we just started, which will be 5 years, and then we can add the chapter. Yeah.
And I'm sure, I mean, we could have done a lot more in terms of like data manipulation and quantitative, sophisticated statistical analyses and stuff like that. I'm not sure if that was ever really like a strong priority for us. Again, I think I'm more of a methodologist than I am a statistician. So, I think it's more important to have those fundamentals in terms of information gathering than actually analyzing information, in a sense, if you think about it. But yeah, I don't remember, Benjamin, was there anything else that we had talked about that didn't make it?
I think earlier on, I think several of the chapters we just couldn't find somebody, but then Melissa stepped up.
Sure.
And I did a little bit. So I think we have a pretty good coverage on many things. Obviously, every chapter is very much also the view of the authors there.
Yeah.
And I think I really like that. So it's not a sort of mechanical sort of discussion where everybody follows the same protocol. We really let people find the best way to discuss the topic. And obviously, as editors, we did push them. We pushed everybody quite a lot to also really focus, for instance, on the limits of their approach. Sometimes you ask people to write a chapter on a certain approach that will show what's great about it. But that wasn't good enough for us. Or there were some people who may have been too negative, and we also wanted them to highlight, what is good about it.
And I must admit that came out to me as a really strong point, because you sort of read it, you were like, that's really compelling. And then my cynical brain kind of kicked in and went, well, hold on a minute. And then they took it further than I would have done, which is the sort of, here's the downside thing, which I think points towards exactly what you're talking about, right? Which is, this isn't straightforward. There is no one-size-fits-all solution. And almost whatever course of action or inaction you choose has consequences in terms of stuff that you're potentially missing, the data that might produce, you might misinterpret it. And so this all goes towards saying, actually, we think of compliance as a relatively simple thing. Just make sure people comply with the rules.
Yeah.
It's not that easy. It's really hard. And that's why you need all these disciplines, and you're going to have to make some calls. And so there is risk management in how you do compliance.
Exactly. And even in how you do measurement. The one chapter I would have loved to have, but we just didn't have it, is a chapter on the ethics of compliance, of measuring compliance. So both the academic sort of ethics, there can also be the sort of legal profession ethics. There's a lot of issues here. So for instance, I tried to collaborate with a major multinational in doing a study together. We could never figure out a way where I would fall under their privilege with still having academic autonomy.
Yeah.
On the US law, that's just impossible. Mm-hmm. So there's all kinds of considerations on the ethics side of this, which I think would have been interesting.
Yeah, and I think, also just even thinking more broadly than the ethical consideration, an entire chapter on practitioner-scholar relationships and collaborations would be a really important contribution. And not just in terms of corporations, but regulatory agencies too. I have incidences where I've tried to reach out to regulatory agencies and collect data, or do observations or do interviews, and I've been told that they don't want to be the ones on the autopsy table, I believe is how they put it. So there is also these considerations of legal liability and concerns about what is going to be done with the data and how do you kind of overcome those obstacles. So I think that's definitely something that we should work more on. And then just in general, thinking through missing pieces. So if your listeners have anything that they would like to see in the next version, definitely feel free to reach out to us. I would love to hear the public demand, if you will. I think that would be really helpful.
Melissa, I'm really scared if we talk more, it's going to be the next book. I mean, the thing I've been thinking about, which
it's
is
going to be your handbook of compliance all over again. It's going to be 2 volumes.
Well, I just did a session on compliance technologies, and one of the things I see, and it's really closely related to our book, but there could be a sort of new book. I mean, for instance, AI, artificial intelligence, and measurement of compliance, video footage. So as a scholar I collaborate with who studies street fights through video footage, and then has also developed algorithms so you can actually go beyond human coding. We have people studying human trafficking through financial data. There is Jean-Louis van Gelder, who's using VR as sort of a to do factorial, to do sort of vignette experiments.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, these things are not only applied to corporate, but they may be interesting for corporate. So I think the next frontier is going to be about, okay, what do new technologies actually mean in compliance management and also in compliance measurement?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's complicated enough at the moment, right? Because you've got Josephine Nelson's work on surveillance and the downsides. And so you start to look, just even with the technologies that are commonly deployed,
Yep.
You've got this challenge. So I think that's really, I thought you were going to go into NFTs. I don't quite know what the link is, but I'm absolutely convinced there is one on some, or at least there'll be a vendor somewhere out there telling you there's a connection with it. So I think that's a fascinating way to look at it. And look, I think that's a great note looking forward to say this job is not done, which is why it's a tremendous privilege to, one, have both of your time. Secondly, to be able to read this joyous collection of stuff. And it's not an academic read by any stretch of the imagination. I don't mean that insultingly. I mean it genuinely in terms of practitioner audience should be reading this, because it's
a big compliment.
And it's the sort of thing I think, and I loved your depiction, Benjamin, of being able to dip in and dip out. And it's like, grab something, have a look at it, and you will be wiser about the thing that you're looking at. Even if it doesn't give you the answer, it'll make you more capable of thinking about the challenge that you're facing. And so I think a lot of people feel like we almost need revolution in their compliance program, right? We know it's not working. What can we do? And this, I think, you can get revolution through this, but there's also a nice evolutionary phase. So I love the fact that you'd approached it in that way, and that it's bite-sized chunks that we can all handle. And you've kind of given us a taste for all the things that we ought to be looking at. So thank you, as ever, for being a fabulous guest on the and just incredibly entertaining and engaging and insightful. And thank you for writing a book that I think was absolutely necessary. And as I said before, I wish I'd had this years ago, but hey, better late than never. I will put links to that, your research, all the usual things in the show notes.
If I can say one thing for readers who are interested in buying the book. So the current price is very high because it's really priced to sell to institutional libraries. So if you have a library, you can ask them to become part of the Cambridge Core. In 6 months, we just heard from our publisher, a paperback comes out at about $40. So a more reasonably priced, it's still a high price, but it's not.
It's worth every cent, penny, and dime.
But I just want to be sure that readers are aware that in 6 months they can buy a cheaper version. Amazing.
That'll give me a competitive advantage for 6 months where I can seem really smart by quoting what's in the book, and then people catch up and realize where I've got it all from. Melissa and Benjamin, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Christian. It was really fun nerding out with you.
So that's it for this episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to Melissa and to Benjamin, and to you for listening. To find out more about their book, Measuring Compliance, to hear the previous episodes that featured Benjamin and some of the other contributors to the book, have a look in the show notes. There are links to those there. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. I'll be back very soon with another episode of this show, but in the meantime, if you're interested in finding out more about human risk, the work that I do for my clients, and the ways that I can help you, visit human-risk.com. There you can also subscribe to the Human Risk newsletter. Thanks a lot for listening. Keep measuring your compliance, stay safe, and I'll see you very soon.